Hello, welcome back to the Stitching Scotland Story podcast. On this episode, we're joined by Sir Geoff Palmer, Scotland's first Black professor and notable human rights activist. In today's episode, we sit down with Geoff to discuss his own story, from his journey from Jamaica to Scotland to how he was set on the path to becoming Scotland's first Black professor. We discuss how cultural artefacts like the Great Tapestry of Scotland can be a tool to help celebrate as well as acknowledge different stories within Scottish history. We also explore the stories that connect us to a shared sense of culture and to belonging. Geoff also tells us what it's like to be stitched into history. Enjoy.
My name and titles are Professor Sir Geoff Palmer, and presently I'm the Chancellor of the Heriot-Watt University. Now, my relationship with the tapestry, and I'm saying tapestry because there are many.
Yes.
But I was involved with the diaspora tapestry. Andrew Cummey invited me to take part, and I thought it was a great honour. And we discussed, the production of the tapestry, and there were 2 panels left to be stitched, and they couldn't find anybody to stitch them. And I offered. There was this great surprise. But then I didn't tell them that my mother was a dressmaker when she migrated to London in 1951 as a member of the Windrush generation. She did instruct me about stitching as a young boy in Jamaica. And I volunteered. Mm-hmm. So I stitched 2 of the panels of the diaspora tapestry. There was one panel of me which my daughter stitched, and she is based in Glasgow. She's one of the directors of the Glasgow Science Museum, and she was very surprised when she was approached to stitch a tapestry of me, because I don't think she ever stitched anything in her life before. But she made a great job of it, mm-hmm. and we're all very pleased that she did that. So my association with the tapestry was very significant in a way, mm-hmm. and its impact all around the world has been significant, because it shows Scottish history in a very, I would say, a form that the public mm-hmm. can educate themselves. And I think that's the power of tapestries.
It really is. And what is it like for you, because the Great Tapestry of Scotland, the Scottish Diaspora Tapestry, both designed by Andrew Cummey, mm-hmm. these have become cultural artefacts in and of themselves, and in that way are becoming a part of Scottish history themselves as this largest community cultural arts project, I believe, in the world, but also because you have now been stitched into Scottish history, and you're now yourself embedded into this history. What is that like?
It's obviously completely undeserved. When I came to Scotland in 1964, mm-hmm. I didn't plan it. It was just I was rejected at an interview in London, famous interview which I've described before, and it was where I went for an interview, and a very famous politician. I wanted to do a master's or mm-hmm. a postgraduate degree. And I went for this famous interview, and it was in 1964. Mm. And this politician told me I should go back to where I came from and grow bananas. And I did point out it was difficult to grow bananas in Haringey, where my mum lived. So therefore that didn't get me the position, but I felt better. But what I was expressing then was my sense of belonging.
Yes.
My sense of belonging. Mm-hmm. Jamaica has been part of the British setup mm-hmm. since 1655, and therefore I'm going nowhere. Exactly. My ancestors contributed to this country, and therefore it was the mother country, I was told, mm-hmm. and mothers don't get rid of their children under normal circumstances. Mm-hmm. And therefore, when I arrived here in 1955, that was the confidence I had. I felt no fear or concern. Mm-hmm. So in 1964, I came in 55. In 1964, when the politician told me that, I wasn't concerned either. However, there was an advert for the Heriot Watt College, and I applied for that. I was interviewed by this wonderful woman called Professor Anna MacLeod. There's a hall of residence now named after her at the Heriot Watt. But she was wonderfully Scottish. She wore a tweed suit, smoked a senior service, no tips, because she told me only whims smoke cigarettes with tips.
She sounds like a character.
And she smoked 50 packets of 50 on her desk. So she was, and during the day sometimes she'd be drinking a beer in her office. So she was quite a person.
Yeah, she sounds it.
And she interviewed me. And she took me. And that was very significant because she was a person who did things but she didn't tell you why. So when she interviewed me, the interview was quite relaxed on my part because I was being interviewed for research on barley, which I knew nothing about, and beer and whiskey, which I knew nothing about in terms of their production. And I think the interview a bit of it went as follows. And what do you know about barley? I said nothing. And what do you know about beer and whiskey? I said nothing. And after a while, she just said, I think it was less than 5-10 minutes, she said, into the interview, she said, I'm going to take you. And I said, why? And she said, when I was telling you about the importance of the research and about the industry, you were looking out the window. And she said, that was a great point in your favour, young man. And I said, well, why was that a great point in my favour? And she said, I hate keen people. and it was interesting. That approach, you may have thought it was casual.
Right.
However, she later on, when I got to know her well, she had checked my background. She had checked that I came to this country in 1955 on my own. I travelled from Jamaica.
How old were you then?
I was 14 years and 11 months, fortunately. And I'm speaking to you because of that 1 month.
Really?
Because she brought me here to work. She knew nothing about the educational system or the requirements. And the day I arrived on the 3rd of March and on the 4th of March, she lived in one room in the attic and we both stayed in the one room and she gave me breakfast the next morning. I've just travelled 5,000 miles. I've not seen her since 1951.
Yeah.
And she woke me up and I said, what we're doing today, Mother? And she said, you're going to work. I just about had a fit because in Jamaica, nobody's ever told me about work.
Oh.
So I got dressed. You don't argue with your mother or my aunt. And we got to the door, just about to leave the house in Islington. And there was a man at the door, with a briefcase looking very formal. And he said to my mom, is that Godfrey Palmer? The man at the door just said, well, if that's Godfrey Palmer, where are you going? And my mom says, we're going to work. He came yesterday from Jamaica. And the man said, you can go to work, but he can't. He's not 50. And my mom begged, and she pleaded, she said, it's cost her, £86. And it took her from 1951 to 55 to save that. And therefore, he really has to go to work to help me pay the rent, etc. And the man just said, I don't make the rules. He's got to go to school for the 1 month. And it's interesting that I've spoken to people, when I've given lectures, and somebody from the Care Commission in Scotland said to me, a lot of people would have listened to your mother and let her keep you at home for the month, thinking they're being helpful. To her.
Yeah.
And the point is that the man actually was obeying the rules as he knew them. And I went to my first school, my mom took me to, and which is significant in my life because this was 1955, and I was given a little test, and I was designated educationally subnormal. And then I went to the other school, the local school, which was secondary modern, which was a lower level. And fortunately, the headmaster took me, but he didn't take me for 1 month. He took me for the term. following term, which was summer term. Had it been winter term, I wouldn't be playing cricket. So my name change was when I went to work at London University at Queen Elizabeth's College, which was a College of London University. And the professor at my interview in 1958, he came into the room like this, and I was sitting here, and it's Professor Chapman, and he just said, "What's your name, young man? Are you the young man for the job?" I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "What's your name?" And I said, "Godfrey Henry Oliver Palmer." And he said, "Can I call you Jeff? You can have the job." And I said, "Fine." And I've called myself Jeff ever since. And the only person who's not accepted it was my mother.
I was going to say, in the Tapestry of Scotland now, you're a Jeff.
Yes.
So you've been memorialised as Jeff.
Oh, Jeff is on everything now I do. But the point is that was the nature of our society. And what I represent or reflect in many ways is that.
Well, and that's the thing that we're trying to sort of to bring it back to the conversation around the tapestry, is that I spoke with Andrew and I spoke with Alistair, and these were sort of two pioneers of bringing these tapestries to life. But one of the challenges of condensing thousands of years of history into 160 panels is that there are a lot of bits of Scottish history that get overlooked. So you wind up just getting snapshots of particular pieces.
Yes.
So where have we done well in highlighting moments of Scotland's history, and where can we sort of do better in sharing stories that are perhaps overlooked?
Well, that's a very, very important, question, because, as I said, when I came to Scotland in 1964, I had no idea of my Scottish connections at all. I just came up to a country that was in the north, so to speak, and I was speaking to this woman, as I said, and she took me and I started my research. But then I noticed that in 1964, people were asking me where I came from. And I was referred to as an incomer. And that sort of a little annoyed me, because then that sort of brought back my British connection rather than Scottish.
Right.
Because to me, Scotland was part of the mother country. That's where I'm coming from now. So I started to think about it. Before I didn't. So I saw Scotland as Britain, part of Britain. And therefore Scotland was part of the mother country. I didn't know anything about the Scottish links with the Caribbean in terms of history.
Right.
But when I do Burn Suppers, I tell the story that when I was in Jamaica, at my school, which was my church school, we had a teacher who always taught a lot of singing. So this is my first link with Scotland, which I didn't know. So there was a lot of singing. One day I went home and my aunt said, "What did you do at school today, boy?" And I said, "Well, we sang, Auntie." And she said, "What did you sing?" And I said, "We sang 2 songs. One was My Love Is Like a Red, Red Rose." And I could see her face.
Your aunts were rather conservative and deeply religious.
Very religious,
Yes.
Absolutely. So when I said My Love Is Like a Red, Red Rose, they said, "What sort of dirty songs they're teaching you at school these days? I don't want you singing anything but
roses.
you're loving women at your age. We're going to the school and tell them you must not sing."
No singing.
No singing of songs like that. I didn't know that was Burns.
Oh, wow.
And therefore that was my first Scottish contact in terms of, even then I didn't know the author was Burns. And I didn't know it was Scottish. It's when I came to Edinburgh in 64 and I went to Burn Suppers, I began to realise who the person was. But what is therefore significant then about the history is that Burns wanted to go to Jamaica to work in slavery in 1786. But he's also written some powerful things about slavery. So I started to develop my Scottish interest by reading Burns and looking at his work. And therefore, one of the things I would like to say is, people always quote, but he wanted to go to Jamaica in 1786 and he wrote, "Let's go to the Indies, my Mary." Of course. However, if you look at Ode Sacred to the Memory of Mrs. Oswald of Auchengrove, and the Oswalds, Richard Oswald, was a notorious slave owner. And he lived in Auchengrove. The house is still there, in Auchengrove, grand house.
Is it?
And Burns wrote a poem when his wife passed away. And in that poem he said, "She had hands never stretched to save, hands that took but never gave." And to me, that's the avarice of slavery. In 2 lines. So my link then with Scotland started to grow when I started as a student through reading Burns, not history books. And therefore I became aware as I went on more about the Scottish links with the Caribbean in terms of slavery. So what we have is a situation of a history that I started to pursue, like, the Weatherbins and the Oswalds and the Grants of Speyside, and, Aberdeen, the link with slavery. All that I began to accumulate that sort of information because I thought it was critical that the Scottish people became aware of their links with, slavery in the Caribbean.
And some of those stories are connected through these tapestries.
Of course, because what it was is that there were 2 tapestries. When Andrew met me, he invited me to join.
And this was the Scottish diaspora
Scottish diaspora tapestry, and he asked me to join, and we met in a little area called Preston Pans in a pub. And we had many meetings there, and we discussed the panels, and stitches were selected, and when most of the panels were stitched, there were 2 left, which we had stitches for, and I decided to stitch those, and one was of Mary Seacole. She's born in Jamaica, and she was a very famous nurse, Florence Nightingale's companion in a way, in nursing. So therefore I began to be drawn into the Scottish history and links, and the other panel was of a slave carrying a large bunch of sugarcane, and on the sugarcane and the body of the slaves were the names of Scottish slave owners and slave plantations. And those 2 panels, it's a great honour to stitch them, and that was part of the diaspora tapestry.
Yes. The panel you enjoy most on the Great Tapestry of Scotland.
I looked through it and I thought the Viking one, because it has some sort of links with me. You may not think that, but I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, my family asked me, if I had had my DNA done, and I said no, and I said I think one of my daughters had hers done, and I said okay, so I had it done, and then my wife, who has Aberdeen links, her father is from Aberdeen, the DNA was done, and she brought in the results, and she said, "Your DNA is here. Do you want the results?" And I said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, what is it?" And she says, "Okay, you're 80% Nigerian genes, you're 5% Kenyan, I think you're 5% Cameroon," and then it went up to 97%. And I said, "Well, what's the remaining 3%? And she smiled and she said, "Do you really want to hear it?" And I said, "Yeah." She said, "You're 3% Viking from Shetland." And she threw the paper down on my lap and said, "It explains a lot." So those people who may have thought that I'm a little bit aggressive when I'm in a corner, that may be the explanation. With a mix of Viking and African genes, it may not be a good combination to harass. So I thought that was a wonderful explanation. But again, my Scottish connection is not just through culture.
Right.
It's genetics. And therefore, a lot of people from the Caribbean have exactly the same connections as I have. And therefore, my view is that when we look at people, and I don't subscribe to Hume's, that Negroes are inferior to whites, and Kant's view that we are different races with different superiorities. I don't subscribe to that. I believe that we are one humanity.
Indeed.
Nothing less.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Stitching Scotland's Story. Be sure to tune in for our next episode, where I'll be joined by Michelle Sterick, Education Officer at the Great Tapestry of Scotland. Michelle and I will discuss the Great Tapestry of Scotland and how the Visitor Centre uses stories and technology to educate school children and young adults.